Today, Loretta, Baldassar and myself will be talking about two research projects that we're working on this year. I'm going to be talking about the evaluation of the Department of Local Government and Communities, Age-Friendly Communities Local Governments Grants Programme that we've conducted over the last 6 months. Loretta will then introduce the Ageing and New Media Australian Research Council Discovery Project that she leads together with Raylene Wilding from La Trobe University. So UWA was engaged to conduct an evaluation throughout the first half of this year. And the results of our evaluation show overwhelmingly that the grants programme has been very successful in raising awareness of the age-friendly approach and providing local governments with a new and powerful lens to understand the needs of older people living in their communities. As one local government officer described it, the introduction of the age-friendly approach through the grants programme really has been a game changer. As we've already heard this morning, WA has this year been awarded affiliate status of the WHO Global Network of Age-Friendly Cities and Communities in recognition of the outstanding work that's being done here. And one of the factors that's led to this award is the unique partnership between state and local government in creating age-friendly communities in Western Australia. And we found that this has in large part been driven by the financial support provided through the grants programme. In conducting the evaluation, we were asked firstly to look at process to assess how local governments in WA engage with the funded age-friendly research activities and planning activities and how the grants programme helped that process to evolve. We were also tasked with considering impact, and here we found the results were a bit more mixed. Some local governments have done this really well, and we've gathered qualitative data, many great examples, often from people I can see here in this room, about how the grants programme, together with other intersecting initiatives, have translated into tangible improvements for older people living in Western Australian communities. But with some other local governments, this has been more patchy, and some have found it difficult to integrate the age-friendly approach into their ongoing work. So our findings and recommendations have been compiled into a report for the department, and the summary report, you can see the cover there, with all these details, will be released in the coming weeks. So our evaluation research was conducted in 3 stages. We reviewed, firstly, all of the documents related to the grants programme. We interviewed 28 local government officers and managers from all across the state, as well as 15 stakeholders from state government agencies and related NGOs. And then we conducted an online survey of all local governments in WA. And I should say here, we got over 100 responses from a total of 80 local government areas. So that's a 56% response rate across the state and 83% response rate here in metropolitan Perth. So thank you everyone for contributing to make this evaluation a success. We found awareness of the grants programme is very high. 87% of our online survey respondents knew about the grants programme and the age-friendly approach. And of course, engagement with age-friendly is also extremely high. 75.5% of seniors living in WA now live in a local government area that's been funded under the grants programme. So our top-level findings are that local governments in Western Australia are very conscious of the challenges and the opportunities posed by an ageing population, and are really ready to respond to those challenges and those opportunities. We found that the age-friendly approach is widely recognised as best practice because it is easy to apply, because it's intuitive, and because it has credibility as a WHO global model. We found that both the grants programme and also the support of collegial networks are essential to driving engagement with the approach, which is why events like the one we're having today are really very important. So in our report, we've identified 10 key issues that are essential to understanding age-friendly here in Western Australia. Now, there's no time today to talk about all of these in any detail, and you can read these findings and the related recommendations in the report when it's released. But I'd like to briefly focus here on the 10th key issue. Creating an age-friendly Western Australia is an ongoing process. Great advances have been made, but there are more developments still to come. The grants programme has emphasised planning to date, but ongoing implementation and evaluation of age-friendly initiatives are equally important. Many WA local governments are doing this really well. They're continually reviewing and improving their age-friendly work. 4 WA local governments are already members of the WHO Global Network of Age-Friendly Cities and Communities, and now that the state government has affiliate status, we can hope that many more local governments will be able to follow them. But there is a clear need to to support local governments, to support each other, to engage with the age-friendly approach, to re-engage with the age-friendly approach, to implement new initiatives, and to develop mechanisms to evaluate the success of new initiatives in new age-friendly work. Finally, I'd just like to say, in addition to our core findings and recommendations, in our report we identify 4 emerging focus areas that we predict will be very important moving forward. So, as Jane already mentioned, new WHO research emphasises the importance of using measurable indicators to deliver baseline data and measure success in creating age-friendly environments. Older people are diverse, and they're becoming more so. New adaptations of the age-friendly approach will need to explicitly address multiple diversity issues for older people as a key dimension of success in creating age-friendly communities. Age-friendly is the established global best practice, yet the language of age-friendly remains restricted generally to interested practitioners and policymakers. The next step is going to be to normalise that language across government and community to drive public support for age-friendly initiatives while simultaneously tackling ageism and reducing residual stigma. And finally, the world is now in a digital age, but digital capabilities among older people and local digital infrastructure vary quite dramatically. Supporting digital citizenship among older people is, we think, an essential component in creating an age-friendly future. I'm going to hand over to Loretta now, who's going to present some current research being conducted by her team at UWA and at La Trobe University.
Thanks very much, Kat. So this project, called Ageing and New Media, is funded by the Australia Research Council, and we're about halfway through at this point and currently in the process of conducting fieldwork. So our project is located at the intersections of research on ageing, migration and diversity, and new media or digital literacy, which is occupying a growing space of scholarship. But what we think is missing from these research agendas is a focus on what we call informal, distant care support networks, and their role in supporting the health and well-being of older Australians as they age. So what are distant care networks? Hands up, I'd like to ask you to put your hands up if you currently care about and care for family and friends who are living overseas. Okay, I think that's about half, if not more than half. In a place like Perth, the most isolated capital city in the world, nearly all of us fall into this category. And in the literature, we talk about transnational families, or families who have members who live in different countries, but still manage to stay together and function as a family and have a sense of familyhood despite that distance, and despite being separated by considerable time. And it's likely that distant care responsibilities will increase as our lives become more mobile. We may not move as we age, but it's likely that our children and our friends will move away, creating distant care networks for all of us. Now, most policies and studies rarely acknowledge that an older person might have a life that extends beyond the boundaries of the local government area's service provision. Now, I'm not saying for a minute that it's not important to concentrate on local government service provision to local communities, but I am suggesting that we need to expand our understandings of ageing in place to include these distant networks of care. How do we provide care to distant support networks, to our friends and family living overseas? The main practices and processes of distant care are just the same as the ones we use for our local friends and family: financial support, visiting, and in particular, emotional and moral support. The emotional and moral support provided in distant care networks relies on, and has always relied on, communication technologies. In the past, that was the postal service. Remember the blue airmail envelopes? Some of us are old enough to remember them. Today, there's been a radical social transformation in how we can maintain and facilitate our distant care networks because of new media, because of the digital age, because of the internet. So mobile phones, Skype calls, emails, Facebook, social network platforms, these have revolutionised the way we stay in touch across distance and have made it possible to care across distance. In fact, for the last 30 years, really primarily I've been a scholar of migration, and what astonished me about the impact and transformation of social uses of new technologies is that now migration and mobility is expanding people's networks of care, where in the past migration really truncated them, really broke them down. And yet now we have an intergenerational expansion, particularly because it's the younger generations that tend to help the older generation use these new technologies. And so in families, transnational families of migrants, you have younger people facilitating the distant care and becoming engaged in it in a way that they weren't before. In the past, they may have signed their name at the end of the blue airmail letter. Now they're setting up the Skype call and developing relationships across distance. So our research project then investigates how communication and other new technology, which we could summarise as digital literacy, can assist and expand the maintenance of support networks. Now, I'm not talking about those wonderful new technologies we saw some examples of in Jane's presentation. They are another set of technologies, assistive technologies and telecare and so on, which are very important and are radically changing our abilities to age well as well. But I'm talking about social care, a social approach to care, and looking at social care in lived communities, but trying to increase awareness about the potential role of distant care networks and virtual care networks that may not be proximate. And currently these are overlooked. They're a bit invisible in our policy discourse, in our understandings of community care. But before going into a bit more detail and showing you some examples to make this hopefully a bit clearer, I'd like to pick up 2 points from the evaluation that Katrina and I have been working on, which intersect directly with our project. So the first point concerns the thorny question of culture, the diversity issue. And we had this raised in question time. And the question of diversity came up as a key challenge for local governments in the evaluation, and we raised it as a future issue, an area that needs work. This is no surprise given Australia's complex multicultural population, with nearly 11% aged 65 or over in the 2011 and expected to rise significantly over the next decade. The populations of Australians born in southern Europe are ageing even more rapidly. For example, 57% of the Italy born in Australia were aged 65 or over in 2011, and those numbers are increasing. So cultural difference and migration is a major focus of our ARC project. We are developing case studies in this Ageing and New Media project of 7 country groups, including Italy, the UK, Burma, a refugee sample of Karen, Somalia, China, India, as well as an Australian-born sample. Now, the 8 domains of an age-friendly community, which you can see behind me, were originally based on the 6 determinants of active ageing. Culture is a cross-cutting determinant along with gender, and so it is not specifically identified in the 8 domains. Culture and gender are rightly considered cross-cutting themes, which highlights how they impact on all the other determinants and their cross-cutting significance. However, the 8 domains invite specific action and activity, while the cross-cutting themes can be more easily overlooked or can be hidden behind broader social inclusion rhetorics. So somehow, thinking about making culture a more specific issue might assist in a way forward. I don't have time to explore the culture issue further in this presentation, but I did want to highlight it as a critical area that needs more focused attention and strategy development. In our ARC project, we are drawing on important research by Zontini and Reynolds that highlights the important role of what they call cultural brokers. Often members of the second migrant generation, these are people who were born in the host country or arrived as young children and were schooled in the host country, and I predict there are many second generation members in the audience here today working in this area. Their findings showed clearly that communities with competent cultural brokers who deeply understood both mainstream and minority cultures, are able to access and disseminate information about ageing and care services better than any other form of intervention. Of course, there's a proviso here that no single cultural broker necessarily represents all sectors of their communities, which are made up of people from diverse genders, ages, class and regional backgrounds, and we have to be particularly attentive to that, particularly gender. But their work provides a solid starting point, a model that is in fact now being trialled in some local governments here in Perth. And maybe we can talk about these issues more during the panel discussion. In our project, we're drilling down into this brokerage model by examining both local and distant support networks and how they facilitate age-friendly outcomes. The second point that links the evaluation in our project is the domain of communication and information. This is the domain that sometimes raises the question of digital literacy and access to the internet, which is becoming increasingly important, especially as the major portal of service, the My Aged Care website, is a digital service. Our ARC project examines the actual and potential role of digital literacy or access to the internet and new media in general to the development of this age-friendly domain. So we're hooking our ideas onto this particular domain. More specifically, we are interested in the role new media can play in the well-being of people as they age, including migrants from non-English speaking backgrounds, because one thing about the internet is you have a plethora of languages immediately available to you. We think increased digital literacy can increase social support networks, decrease isolation and expand social service delivery. So now let me talk more in detail about our research project. I want to begin with a case study from our research, and I've chosen an Australian-born older person because I want to impress on you that this is not just an issue that relates to non-English background speakers, but that non-English background speakers perhaps have more critical needs. As people age, we all know, they often experience diminished mobility and increased isolation, whether they continue living in their own homes or move into residential care. A substantial body of research shows that this often leads to reduced access to support networks and, as a result, poor health outcomes. This is particularly acute for migrants, where family members often live at a distance and language and cultural barriers limit their access to services. But it is also true for English speakers. So and that's why I want to introduce to you Australian-born Dorothy and her family as a case study. Dorothy has lived her whole life in Melbourne, moving house only 3 times, all within a 20-kilometre radius. The first time she moved was soon after she got married, when she, her husband and her first child moved out of her parents' home into their newly built suburban home. The second time was after their 4 children had moved into homes of their own, when her husband was retiring. They decided to downsize, to boost their retirement income and to reduce their home and garden maintenance. Dorothy stayed in this home for 15 years after her husband died. Up until about 6 years ago, Dorothy was an active participant in various social clubs and had many friends. She also had an active family life. One of her daughters lived close by and visited her a few times a week. Her grandchildren would often come to see her after school. 2 of her other children lived in Melbourne but at a further distance, and she saw them once a month. But they all spoke to her weekly on the phone. One of Dorothy's children had travelled overseas, Theo. Theo was living in the north of England with his wife and children. They came to visit every 3 years or so, whenever they could afford it. And Theo also phoned his mother once a week. Dorothy loved these phone calls. Theo was her youngest child and a favourite, with an easy way of making her laugh and reminisce. Dorothy's third and final move occurred after she had a fall and was hospitalised. It was a turning point for her, and a rapid decline in mobility followed. She lost her confidence not only in driving but also in taking public transport. Her daughter was attentive in organising services for her so that she could remain comfortable in her own home. Her grandchildren would also drop in on her most afternoons to see if she needed anything and just to say hello. However, after about 2 years of intermittent but increasingly regular hospital stays, it was decided that she should move into residential care, her 4th move. As a result of her relocation, her family and her social life were also radically reconfigured. Her nearby daughter and grandchildren continued to visit her weekly, and the other children in Melbourne maintained frequency of visits. They all kept phoning her regularly. However, her son in England found it increasingly difficult to communicate with her. This had already become a problem during her regular hospital stays, but it was not because of her frailty or her hearing. It was instead because of the lack of access to communication technologies. Dorothy had had a mobile phone but found it difficult to use in the hospital. Then when the phone was dropped one day and stopped working, her daughter did not replace it. The care home Dorothy was now living in provided excellent nursing care and a range of social activities. However, personal phone lines were not supported, and this is increasingly common because there's an expectation that people have mobile phones. Although they were also not prohibited. So any phone calls had to be made through central reception and then the telephone transported to the resident. After Dorothy first moved into residential care, Theo did try to continue his weekly phone calls, and the staff were very obliging. But for Theo, the inconvenience of his weekly call to not only the staff, but also his mother, because of timetabling and what she had to do and when she had to do it, became more evident than any pleasure it might bring to his mother. He began to call less often, and the relationship gradually faded away, causing both Dorothy and Theo much sadness. So Dorothy's story highlights the potential consequences of lack of access to communication technologies, even if that access has to be facilitated. So for many older people, digital literacy requires assistance, assistive digital literacy. I'm sure you would all agree that Dorothy and Theo had a right to stay connected, and that access to facilitated communication would have helped them to maintain their relationship. Currently, there's absolutely no policy providing baseline equity goals for digital access in the aged care sector. It's extremely patchy, despite the fact that aged care services are increasingly delivered online, and the aged care portal is a pertinent example. So we're in our research project investigating ways of introducing facilitated digital literacy to support social distant care and social network maintenance as part of care service provision, with wonderful results. Some examples from our recent fieldwork in Perth helps to demonstrate the potential role of digital literacy. There's a group of some 50 elderly people who are members of an internet club run by Umbrella, and I think Umbrella might be present today, which meets twice a week for 3 hours at a time in a hall that is set up with computers and internet access. The members are all migrants who arrived in Perth from Europe in the 50s and 60s. Some require assistance to attend, so they have a bus service. Others are more mobile and drive themselves. Occasionally, the staff provide formal lessons on topics such as cyber security, so there is a dark side to digital literacy, we know, or how to use a platform such as Facebook. More often, though, the members simply do their own thing. And that doing their own thing and supporting each other in the learning, a community of learning, is a really important element to this. It's about embedding learning in social relationships. It's very difficult to bridge the generational divide in digital literacy by teaching a formal curriculum to older people. We've discovered it's much more beneficial to try and embed that learning in existing social relationships and make it a community experience. Some people research recipes for dishes they would like to make. Others use Google Earth to virtually visit their childhood hometowns. Others search YouTube for songs they recall. The Internet Club then has multiple sources of value for its members. As a meeting place and a social activity, it is important in helping them to meet each other and remain socially active. They are able to share memories of the past as well as their current interests with each other and learn from each other as they encounter new tools, needs or capacities on the internet in an environment that reduces fear. The club thus expands these people's proximate social networks and increases the range of modes of communication within those networks, including access to services, information, all of this now increasingly provided online. But it also provides important tools and knowledge for maintaining and expanding their distant social networks around Australia and around the world, either sending emails, posting messages on Facebook or talking on Skype. Usually, as I said before, by engaging with the children or grandchildren of their siblings or friends, so facilitated Skype calls. So our research has highlighted an imbalance in the age and adoption of technologies, the so-called digital divide, which appears to increase in rural and remote areas. And we don't have time, but we've got statistics that show the rapid decline or drop-off of internet access for older people in remote and rural areas. And we do have rural and remote sites in our study as well. This is an issue we are examining further, as well as developing an intervention project designed to tackle these issues in residential care homes and for people ageing at home. And we're hoping to develop policy recommendations to provide a baseline set of practices that support digital literacy in aged care services, but based on evidence-based results. What we have discovered through this fieldwork so far is that physical proximity remains important, but that it is not the only resource available that can provide positive ageing in place. So this section of the mobile phone bill, I'm not sure how easily you can see it, is of a resident in a care facility showing just how active she is in the calls to her distant support networks. This is a woman who's 90 years old, ringing outer London, Italy, Bologna, Margaret River, Argentina, as well as all her friends in Perth. And she doesn't differentiate between them. She doesn't actually see many people face to face. Most of her emotional and moral support comes from these virtual forms of communication, which are very important to her, which she can do sitting in her lounge chair, in her armchair, in her residential care room. So there's now a fairly substantial body of research identifying some of the factors required to achieve a successful, positive or active form of ageing in place. So I want to go to this ageing in place mantra, which we're all very familiar with and which is very important, especially to local governments who are delivering services. So access to health services and transport, attention to nutrition and activity, appropriate housing options, and more recently, neighbourhoods that are designed to meet the needs of diverse ageing populations. But what this policy and the literature around it tends to overlook completely is the role of distant support networks in belonging, identity and social engagement. So while ageing in place is the preferred option for care of older people, because the term is associated with a sense of autonomy, independence and homeliness, all things that are valued in the cultural context in which the policy mantra prevails. However, the social networks of family and friends who are recognised in these accounts of ageing in place remain limited to those who are geographically proximate. So because distant social support networks remain under-acknowledged in the research and policies of ageing in place, we actually know very little in terms of evidence-based knowledge about the potential role of distant support networks. We're beginning to gather this in our project, but we have a really clear hunch from our work in migration studies that it's critical, especially to migrants of all ages. So access to the internet is key to emotional well-being, and distant care is an increasing practice and set of processes that we should think about incorporating into our ageing in place models. We could add the role of virtual communities as well. So this is where our research comes in, and rather than presuming distance is a barrier to care and support, and that's a really difficult thing to begin to unpick. It's an ontological preference we have to assume that care is best delivered in proximate ways. And it is the gold standard of care, but we want to position distance simply as a factor to be considered alongside other factors that facilitate or inhibit social support and interaction, and begin to deliver distant care as a new term or a new language that helps us identify this. I don't have time to give you the example of the Karen refugee, but this was an old man who didn't think he was using Facebook at all and was quite scared of it, but his children had cleverly set up his mobile phone so that he got all the photos that his community were posting back in the camps in Thailand, around the world where people had moved, and he was actually an avid Facebook liver without knowing it. So again, facilitated technology, and those photos were critical to his sense of well-being and sense of being connected to other people. So sense of connection to place, which we all understand, and we had that wonderful presentation by Barry about connection to place, but it's a very spiritual thing as well. I thought he showed that very clearly, and so that we can have that in virtual ways. So new technologies can deliver multiple outcomes for older people, improving skills, increasing social connection, increasing self-confidence, increasing independence, learning how to use online banking, learning how to look up information, learning how to use Tinder. There are a number of older people who worked this out. Connection to cherished memories, more connected to grandchildren, etc., etc. So the role of technologies in supporting the well-being of older people, and I'm talking again about social care, is what we're on about. Our project is showing how new technologies are transforming practices and processes of care. Some distant care relationships are actually constituted by the new media. So some people's relationships are entirely the SMS messages, or for grandparents and grandchildren, they are entirely the Skype calls. So children associate the computer with grandma, particularly when grandchildren and grandparents have no other ways of communicating across distance. Without that new technology, they wouldn't have a relationship. So it's important to note also that these acts of communication across distance are not delivering some vague and impressionistic presence of the other. The people in our study comment on how well they feel they grow to know their distant kin because of the frequent contact. So, for example, one quote is, "You find out about the little things that happen every day." Several people commented that they have more distant communication than proximate because they put more effort into staying in touch with their distant kin. People spoke about showing more emotion, expressing more overtly feelings of love, like the grandson who said, "You actually have to spell out, 'I love you, Grandma,' in a text." So distance can bring people closer together. So here, I love this meme, the idea that the internet is now a basic human need. And the United Nations argued this case not so long ago. They were arguing it on a platform of access to information, but I would argue it on the basis of an access to social care. So in conclusion, I just want to rapidly tell you a little bit about our methodology. We are doing an ethnographic study. It's very qualitative, although we are hoping to do a survey of internet access in residential care facilities Australia-wide. We're working towards that. But basically, I'm very interested in this notion of social care. This is the idea that when you go to your doctor, she shouldn't just take your blood pressure and make sure you've got enough of the right medicines. She should also be asking you how many people are in your care network, your support network, because we know from excellent research that's being done that if your support network falls below a certain number, I think the magic number is something like 5, your ability to maintain your health and well-being radically plummets. So it's not just your blood pressure and your medicines, it's also who are the people in your support network that can support you to maintain taking those medicines, to maintain the proper active lifestyle you need, to support you emotionally and morally through this life. So we've expanded a social network analysis model where we actually map people's networks of support on this kind of figure, and we include in that the distant carers, which are not normally, in the past, have not normally been included. So we count the distant carers and we try to measure their role in the health and well-being of older people. What we want to do next is an intervention where we actually deliver some digital literacy training, some of it facilitated for those who need the facilitation, and then we want to map those networks 6 months later and really provide some evidence about what this can do. So if any of you are interested in collaborating on that kind of intervention, I'd really love to talk to you later. So this could also be a kind of possible evaluation tool in terms of providing that kind of evidence that's so necessary to further work in this field. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.